Okay, welcome to the Temple of Silver Stars public webinar. This is our 11th out of 12 classes in our Paths, Letters, and Correspondences series. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of Silver Star. So yeah, this is our second to last class, so almost there. And this will be the last class of the format that we've been using recently of doing, like 3 letters per class. So after today, we'll only have 1 letter left. So we'll do the very last letter next time, and then some summary stuff. And also some bonus stuff too. I'm going to show you next week some images from like Lady Frida Harris, some of her artwork that isn't very commonly seen. I found some interesting planetary images I wanted to show you. Yeah, we can do some other kind of summary things. But today we've got a lot to go through. As we'll be seeing, as you'll see when we get to the letter Shin, we've got a little more material than usual to cover. So let's just get right into it. And then some of the correspondences here will be abbreviated. You'll see, like, for a few of the letters, I haven't given you a deity. So I've cut a few things a little bit short because it's going to be some extra stuff to talk about. I did want to just correct one small thing from last class. I was reading to you from the English herbalist there, Culpepper, and I was calling him William Culpepper. His name is Nicholas Culpepper. I don't know why I was doing that, but yeah, his name is Nicholas. Anyways, let's get started. So yeah, we're starting with Qoph today. Interesting letter. All right, so Qoph is one of our single letters, so we know that it will be attributed to one of the signs of the zodiac. As always, feel free to type into the chat as we go along, and then I'm happy to hang out at the end of the class if anybody has additional questions. Yeah, so Qoph is one of our single letters. It's the only letter other than the final letter, so it's the only kind of normal letter that goes below the line. So it's also only one of 2 letters that's written with 2 unconnected strokes. Hey is the other one. So the stroke on the right, the kind of curving stroke, that's about the size of like a normal Hebrew letter, and then the stroke on the left goes down like below the line. Yep, so it's a single letter. Our hieroglyphic origin is not clear. There's a bunch of possibilities. It may derive from hieroglyphs meaning needle's eye, or nape, like the nape of the neck, which is like the back of the head, as we'll see in a moment, or possibly also meaning like ape or monkey. The Phoenician letter you can see there gives rise to our letter Q, as well as the Greek kopa and phi as well. I don't know how they got 2 letters out of it, but that's apparently the story. And that Phoenician hieroglyph may have been taken as the Phoenician letter, the shape may have been understood to be either a sewing needle or the eye of a needle. Its sound is a Q or a K sound, which are both pretty similar. And it seems to have varied between like ancient and modern Hebrew, but pretty much the Q or K sound. So our English equivalent is generally going to be Q, though in transliteration, you'll sometimes see it as C or K or as CK, like especially at the end of a word, since in English it looks strange to like end a word in the letter Q. So you'll sometimes see it transliterated differently, but our English equivalent is definitely Q, and obviously is historically related. It has the value of 100. So as we saw, the first 9 letters had the values of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then our second 9 had 10, 20, 30, up to 90. And so now we're getting into the hundreds. Though, of course, we've only got 4 letters left. So that's why we use the final letters to do 500 through 900. All right, so spelled in full, it's spelled Qoph, Vau, Pei. Another word about Qoph, you're not likely to confuse the form of the letter with any other letter, but the name said is sometimes confusing between Qoph and Qoph. I think in modern Hebrew, this letter is said more as like Qoph than Qoph, but kind of Western esotericists usually say Qoph. So we're just distinguishing between the vowel sounds. So this is Qoph, and then the letter attributed to Jupiter and fortune in the tarot, that letter was Qoph. So we can just sort of be careful about pronouncing that. Let's see, so value spelled in full there would be either 186 or 906, depending on whether or not we're using the final value of Pei. I'm not aware of any particularly significant meanings for either of those numbers. So its meaning is back of the head, or like nape of the neck, but back of the head is the one that you should know. Although it's not Hebrew, that doesn't mean that in Hebrew. It can mean ape, the word Qoph in Hebrew, and then it's also related to a root meaning like to surround. But back of the head is the one you should know. And now, especially in contemporary Kabbalah, that this signification of the back of the head becomes associated with like the brain stem, or the the hindbrain, which is the more ancient and more primitive parts of our brain, evolutionarily speaking. And sometimes this is connected to the idea of the subconscious, and we'll see some subconscious imagery. And sometimes it's also connected to the monkey or the ape as being our ancestor. And there's also some stuff about animality that we'll see as well. So there's a nice kind of interesting interlocking set of meanings here. All right, so this is the 29th path. So as always, I'll give you two different versions of the Paths of Wisdom text. Westcott's, the one more important for the Golden Dawn tradition, and then a modern translation from Kaplan. So Westcott gives, the 29th path is the corporeal intelligence, so called because it forms every body which is formed in all the worlds and the reproduction of them. I obviously typed that wrong. Let me look that up and see what that actually says. Oh, it's just the reproduction of them. Yeah. So that there before the them just shouldn't be there. I'll try to correct that. Okay, and then Kaplan gives 29, physical consciousness. It is called this because it depicts the growth of everything that becomes physical under the system of all the spheres. So this idea of I think corporeal is a really nice way of thinking about the way that we talk about this letter and about the formation of the body, and about being, physical, and bodily. And also about the formation of the body. That's very important for our symbolism. Let's just move on. All right, so here it is on the Tree of Life, and it's connecting Netzach to Malkuth. And so as connecting to Malkuth, that's where we see some of the bodily stuff. This is about the formation of the body. It's interesting to think about that being connected to Netzach. That gets quite complicated, so I don't want to get into it here, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, as the three paths that issue from Malkuth, we'll see the one on the left, Shin, today as well, and then the one connecting Malkuth to Yesod, Tav, we'll see next week. These three paths take on a lot of significances. We already talked about the fact that they can spell the word kisheth, meaning bow or rainbow. And another thing you'll also see is that these paths they become almost like the three channels in yoga. So you have like the central channel rising from Malkuth to Yesod, and then the two paths on either side become like the Ida and Pingala, the fiery and either sort of fiery and solar on one side, and then like watery and lunar on the other. And so this path of Qoph takes on the kind of watery and lunar significance. So it would correspond with like the Ida in yogic anatomy. And then we'll see Shin in a little while, which would correspond with the Pingala. And then Tav, which we'll see next week, will correspond with the central channel. All right, so our Yetziratic attribution for Qoph is the sign Pisces, our last or 12th sign of the zodiac, which means the fishes. So Pisces is a yin or a nocturnal sign. It's a mutable sign. It's a water sign, and is the domicile of Jupiter, and Venus is exalted in Pisces. So I'll read you a few of my keywords here for Pisces, and then we can talk for just a minute about how that comes out of the the basic qualities here. So let's see, for Pisces I have taking in, accepting, listening, absorbing, including, subsuming, formless, lack of boundaries, soft, doing emotional work, exploring depths, indulgence or escapism, faith, trust, acceptance of contraries, and then also things like meaning and quality. And so, yeah, we can see how this comes out of water, out of mutability. So, water, of course, is an extremely mutable element, an extremely formless element. And then as a mutable sign, it's water in its most changeable state. So this is an extremely changeable, mutable, formless kind of sign. And, Pisces type people can sometimes have, like I was just reading with the qualities here, there can sometimes be, this sense of being You're not necessarily like lacking boundaries, like invading other people's boundaries, but of being somehow formless. But as Jupiter, there's also the expansive quality here. It's not just mutable and watery; it's also expansive. And so, because of the lack of boundaries and the kind of expansive, and we can think about Jupiter trying to produce like coherence. Jupiter always kind of is like bringing together contraries. And so especially here with water and mutability, we see kind of the ability to accept all contraries. Things like faith and trust, that obviously comes out of Jupiter. And then so some of this kind of, this uses like absorbing and including and subsuming. That's both from the watery signification as well as from the Jupiterian. And I think it's fairly easy to see why Venus would be exalted here, why Venus would express her qualities like particularly well, because of this big sort of universal aspect of Pisces that Venus is, sense of like kind of universal love or love in its like deepest sense and harmony. Okay, yeah, let's just move on here. So for our magical weapons, we have the twilight of the place. Now this again, like some of the other zodiac signs we've seen, is about the like the conditions or furniture or the setup for the temple or ritual space. And so this is like the darkness of the place. Ritual spaces are not always, but very often are going to be pretty dimly lit, often just by a few candles or something like that. So that dimness, which is important. I mean, being a dim space and a candlelit space is certainly a mind-altering thing. I mean, it's a subtle thing, but it really contributes to atmosphere. And so as a part of the ritual here, that's what this attribution is. And with some of the subconscious kind of imagery that we'll see, it makes a lot of sense with the twilight and doing ritual. Kind of having visions or sort of liminal experiences. Twilight definitely helps to bring on that mental state. We also see the magic mirror. It's appropriate to water, into kind of the reflective and illusionistic qualities of Pisces and of Qoph. Interestingly, the mirror is often sometimes associated with Venus, and this is the sign of her exaltation, which I thought was interesting. Now, in the tarot, we have the 18th Atu, the moon. We'll see the moon, of course, in a few minutes, but I just want to sort of highlight here that this is sometimes one of the attributions that people who don't like our system of attributions will point to as a kind of problem, where the sun, as we'll see, is going to correspond with the sun, but the moon, the card in the tarot, is going to correspond with Pisces rather than the planet, the moon. And some people will sometimes cite this as not making sense. But I think it does actually make sense. I think that's a very shallow kind of reading just based on like words. Yeah, and so we'll talk about it more as we come to the tarot card. Also, the 8, 9, and 10 of Cups can be attributed here because they're the 3 decans of Pisces. For perfume, we have ambergris. It really doesn't actually explain why ambergris. Ambergris is attributed to Kether. It's possible that something about the origin of ambergris. Ambergris is a waxy substance that's produced in the digestive system of sperm whales. Apparently, when it's initially vomited out or excreted by them, it has a very like foul odor, though as it ages, it becomes more pleasant. And it's used as an element in perfumes, not like as a perfume in and of itself, but as a component in perfume making. Though you can't really get it. Ambergris is illegal in the United States, because of anti-whaling measures, and it's illegal in many other places as well. Crowley also suggests menstrual blood as a perfume or an incense here, and we'll see some of that symbolism when we get to the tarot card. As I think I said when we saw menstrual blood earlier in our going through our correspondences, I don't recommend the usage of blood of any sort unless you really know what you're doing for workings. So now these are obviously practical. One I'm recommending you don't use, and the other is illegal in the United States. So if you wanted a perfume or incense here, I would suggest myrrh maybe as a general watery incense. And it also has some of the bitterness, normally associated with banana, that I think would also be appropriate to Pisces. Oh, yeah, great. Just answered your question, Chad. All right, and then for magical powers, we have bewitchments and casting illusions. And I think that'll make more sense after we look at the tarot card. All right, so for our color scales here, I've got an interesting set of colors. For our king scale here, we've got sort of given two as crimson or ultraviolet. Now, both of these are coming out of the way that the king scale colors, as we've been talking about, are a kind of 12-fold division of the spectrum or the color wheel. So we started with Aries in red, and then we just moved on through the zodiac signs. So Aries was red, Taurus was red orange, Gemini was orange, right? And so you just go through the colors divided into 12. So doing that, and then we saw that Aquarius was indigo. So the color between red and indigo is kind of a red, purple, or a crimson color. And that's the color you see there. The ultraviolet here, I think, my take, Curly doesn't comment on it, but my take on it would be that instead of like looking at the colors as a wheel, if you instead see them as like kind of like an ascending scale, so starting with Aries as like the lowest frequency wave, and then going up to higher and higher frequencies, we would be going like beyond violet to the ultraviolet, which of course isn't a practical attribution because ultraviolet literally cannot be seen by the human eye. So maybe symbolically we can think about it as ultraviolet, but practically it's crimson, just as the color between indigo and red. Yeah, crimson is like as we talked about last week, crimson is like a red color, but slightly shifted towards purple. All right, and then in the queen scale, it's buff, flecked silver white. The silver white kind of flecking maybe is related to the moon or kind of a lunar significance. And then light translucent pinkish brown is, like all the print scale colors, a kind of combination of the king and queen scale colors. So you take crimson and like a buff color, and you get kind of a light pinkish brown. Light translucent pinkish brown was a little bit of a difficult color to come up with. That was the best I could do there. And then for the princess scale color, we've got a stone color. Again, a little bit of ambiguity here. Not all stones are the same color, of course, but I figure it's this kind of stone gray sort of color. And interestingly, Crowley talks about this, the princess scale color, as like the perfection of Pisces here or of Qoph, because he says like the defect of Qoph is of being like illusional or entirely astral, kind of like unreal. And so in its descent down into the world of Asaya and this idea of stone, it's balanced itself out by becoming more material, if that makes sense. All right, for animals, we've got a few here. We've got fish. Now, obviously, Pisces is the fishes. The constellation is two fishes. But Crowley says that the fish, especially in Crowley's way of thinking about animal symbolism, the fish is more appropriate to Mercury. So he, I think, kind of leans towards the dolphin here. He talks about dolphins being appropriate to both Jupiter and Venus, though I wasn't really clear on why. Also, if you read the Book of Thoth, it seems like sometimes Crowley thinks that dolphins are fish or like a type of fish. I don't know what's going on there, if he was just sort of confused about the fact that they're mammals. Yeah, there is that. Now also we have the dung beetle and the jackal, which are both animals that we'll see in the tarot card. And then we also have the dog as appropriate to the moon, which we saw when we did the path of Gimel for the moon. We saw the dog there. For stones, we have the pearl. Again, pearl is appropriate to the moon, and so we have this kind of lunar sort of symbolism coming in through the tarot trump. But I think pearl also makes sense, for Pisces and the watery symbolism. I think that works nicely. Now, for plants, Crowley gives unicellular organisms, which is a little bit funny. I'm not aware of at least in the classification systems that we use nowadays, I don't think any plants are really unicellular, or unicellular things aren't classified as plants. So maybe it has to do with like the system of classification that Crowley would have learned when he was in college. I'm not sure. Or through the Golden Dawn too. As we've been talking about, of course, Crowley got a lot of these significations through a document that like Mathers had compiled. So that's a kind of a little bit weird one, but we could maybe move it to animals or something like that if that was better. And then also opium. Now, opium, of course, is the name of a drug, so I assume what he means here is the opium poppy, which you can see there on the left. Now, in opium, of course, makes a lot of sense with the things here. Opium is, especially I think kind of in a 19th century association with opium as being something that produces vivid dreams and visions. So it has this sort of hallucinatory quality to it. Rather than being just like a painkiller or a form of heroin, like we think of it as. I think it had more of these symbols of of dream and reverie, which is appropriate for this this card, and appropriate for Pisces. All right, and then I'll give you, none of the Greek or Roman gods were particularly relevant here, and one of them was a little bit confusing, actually, so we'll just give you an Egyptian deity here. So this is Khepra. In our tradition, we'll usually see Khepra more like the smaller image there, which is actually some sort of a sculpture or piece of jewelry. I'm not entirely sure what it actually is from. But as a beetle, and often carrying the solar disc in his front claws there. Now this solar disc is kind of stylized with these curving wings coming out to the side. Oh no, I guess that's actually supposed to be the beetle's wings, I think. Not it kind of goes up and like the wings sort of connect up to the sun, which is sort of nice. Because often the beetle will be portrayed with his wings outspread. So Khepra, in the Egyptian tradition, Khepra was often associated with the morning and the dawn. We usually tend to associate Khepra with midnight. And the idea here of the dung beetle and of Khepra is that the dung beetle, lays her eggs in the dung ball and also is seen to roll it. And so Khepra, as a form of Ra, Khepra is almost never treated as like an independent, deity in his own right, but as like an aspect of Ra. So it is solar god himself. And so as like bearing the sun, through the underworld, through the night, back to its rebirth in the dawn. So Egyptians would have seen, dung beetles rolling dung balls, and then the larva of the dung beetle would have hatched out of the dung ball. So there's the idea of like the regeneration and rebirth of life associated with the sun returning each morning at dawn. But for our tradition, we're going to focus more on the fact of Khepra, or what, like in Libra Resh, what's more appropriate, or not more appropriate, but more central to our tradition is the idea of him bearing it through the midnight rather than what happens at dawn. All right, and then we'll look at the magical hierarchy of Pisces. So our divine name, again, this will be the last of our 12 permutations of the Tetragrammaton, the 12 banners of the name. And this one is Hey, Hey, Yod, Vav. All right, and then I've also given you an alternative divine name here. This is a divine name of Jupiter, which is El, a name we've already talked about a few times before. Maybe doubly appropriate here too, because El is also used as a divine name for water. So it's really here because of it's associated with Jupiter, but it works nicely as a name connected to water as well. And for our archangel, we have the archangel of Pisces, which is Amnitziel. And then for Yetzirah, again, there's lots of different angels of the decans and the triplicities and so on. But the angel ruling the house is Pashiel. And then the lesser assistant angel in the sign is Vakabiel. And then the heaven of Messiah is Dagim, which is just the Hebrew name for the constellation Pisces. All right, and then here is our Tarot Trump. So this is out to 18, the moon. Esoteric title is the ruler of flux and reflux. So that's giving this kind of image of, of like cycles or tides. And then child of the sons of the mighty. So this one's, pretty close to some of the traditional images of the tarot that you may be familiar with. You can see we've got these like kind of two towers in the background there. And then we got two like kind of just, animal jackals there standing on the mounds. And then behind them we have Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the underworld. And you'll see Khepra. Now this is actually a dung beetle here. In different versions of the tarot, it'll be sometimes it's portrayed as more like a lobster or a crayfish, sometimes more as a beetle. So this is some form of that idea. But that's Khepra there with the sun, clasped between his claws there, bearing it through the night to the dawn. So you can kind of see that lower portion of the card as like the underworld or something like that. So this is the sun is still underground. Crowley talks about this being symbolically a representation of midnight. We can see the moon. If you can see my cursor there, there's the moon there. And then we also see these like 9 yods falling down here. And the 9 there, of course, refers to Yesod, the sphere of the moon. Let's see. Yeah, and some of there's also unfortunately, there's not enough time to really go into it. There's some interesting like symbolism of fertility here, which interestingly plays into a theme that we've seen a few times already, of there being this weird sort of like coincidentia of like fertility and infertility. So this card is often, and Crowley genuinely in a kind of sexist, misogynistic sort of way, associates this card with like witchcraft and the idea of like the hag, which is essentially like a woman who's no longer, who's no longer capable of becoming pregnant, which Crowley sometimes tends to talk about as being sort of magically useless, which again I think is a pretty chauvinist and misogynistic take on it. But the idea of there being a kind of like infertility that's related to a fertility is appropriate here. There's some biblical mythology, biblical stories that are also relevant here. Some of the stories of like Abraham that you can look into, but it's kind of a complex thing. Let's just move on though, because we've got a lot to cover. But I think there's definitely this sense of something kind of uncanny happening here. Like we saw things about like bewitchment and illusion, and there's all this sort of the double towers and the double jackals in the twilight of it. There's something kind of creepy or about it, right? Doubles and things like that are often like an uncanny or horrific sort of phenomenon. And this is like midnight, the passage between these towers. I think it builds up a nice. Like an atmosphere appropriate to this card. And I think we can also see why this card wouldn't really be appropriately attributed to like the planet, the moon. This is about something, although it's connected to the planet, the moon, this is about something different. If we wanted to connect it more to the moon, maybe we could see it as like the new moon or the dark moon. But certainly the moon has much broader or other significances that don't really fit in well with this card. So I thought maybe like this card could almost be thought of as, instead of being called like the moon, it could be called like the moonlit landscape or something like that, rather than the moon itself. It just makes a little bit more sense in my head. Okay, let's just move on. Yeah, the dark side of the moon, right, sure. And we could think of, like Hecate and things like that, as like a kind of deity here, like lunar, but dark lunar, rather than the bright, nurturing, sort of lunar. All right, so let's just move on to our next letter here. This is the letter Resh, or Resh. You'll hear people say it both ways. All right, so Resh is one of our double letters. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, Lilith is a complex topic. Lilith is often attributed to the Qoph of Malkuth. So, like kabbalistically, Lilith is a little bit difficult. But if you're thinking of like Lilith, the astronomical object, that might fit better. Which is assume is what you're talking. Yeah. Okay. Which is I don't actually know much about Black Moon Lilith, but that's something people could look into if you're interested in it. Okay, so Resh here is one of our double letters, so we know it'll be attributed to a planet. All right, its hieroglyph there is from a hieroglyph meaning head, and literally just depicts a head, and then essentially that just gets increasingly simplified. That becomes the Phoenician letter that you see there, and that Phoenician letter becomes the Hebrew letter Resh. So its sound is basically an R. Now, I'll say two things about it. In different Hebrew dialects, exactly how that's pronounced varies somewhat. I didn't want to get into that. There's no real need to. Like some dialects like trill the sound and some don't, and so on. But it's basically the R sound. And although this is, I think we talked about this already in, I forget which class that would have been, I think in the third class. The fact that although Resh is at least symbolically considered a double letter, there's not a known second sound for it. Like this is like the hard sound, but there's no known soft sound. Or maybe the other way around. All right, so its English equivalent is just going to be R, though, nice and straightforward. It's got a value of 200, and its spelling in full is Resh Yod Shin. It's got a value of 510. There's a couple interesting meanings of 510 that you could look up, like in Sefer Sephiroth. And you might also investigate it as 51 multiplied by 10. I think that's another interesting way of thinking about this card. You can look up the meanings of 51 as well, since it's an interesting number. All right, so its meaning is head. Now, as a Hebrew word, Resh, Yod, Shin, at least in Strong's like correspondence, the only word actually spelled that way I could find meant poverty, which doesn't really fit here and isn't super appropriate. But there are some similar Hebrew words that do actually mean head, though the ones that it was Resh, Vav, Shin, and Resh, Aleph, Shin, I found both in Strong's meaning head. So it's at least similar to Hebrew words meaning head. All right, but head is the one that you should know, and it contrasts nicely with Qoph. Like Qoph is the back of the head, so that's all this kind of weird, like subconscious, sort of bodily stuff. Kind of like astral phenomena. We can think of like the nefesh, the animal soul, all being appropriate to Qoph. And then for Resh, the head, this is going to be more about our consciousness and like the ruach, the ego, a kind of everyday intellect and waking consciousness. So the two letters pair and contrast with each other quite nicely as head and back of the head. Right, we'll do our path of wisdom here. So this is the 30th path. So Westcott gives, the 30th path is the collective intelligence, and astrologers deduce from it the judgment of the stars and celestial signs and perfect their science according to the rules of the motions of the stars. Then Kaplan gives 30, general consciousness. It is called this because it is the means through which the generalizers of the heavens collect their rules regarding the stars and constellations, forming the theory that comprises their knowledge of the Ophan wheels of the spheres. Now, for once, I think Westcott's translation is more comprehensible than Kaplan's here. So it's interesting that Kaplan, this idea of like the generalizers of the heavens, I'm not sure why Kaplan he doesn't have a note on this particular one. So I'm not sure why he didn't go with astrologers, and that seems to be pretty clearly what's being suggested. But astrology has kind of a culturally difficult place, like in Hebrew and in Jewish culture. So it may be in some way related to that, kind of cultural prohibitions against calculating heavenly movements. And then this idea of the Ophan wheels, or the Ophanim, literally means wheels, and they're in our system of classification, anyways. The Ophanim are the angelic choir of Chokmah. It's interesting to think about here. Chokmah is sometimes given as like the supernal sun, or the sun in its highest sense. Yeah, and the idea of the sun being, we're going to see Resh corresponds with the sun. That being connected to astrology, or the governing of the motions of the stars and signs, it sort of makes a lot of sense. Obviously, literally in our solar system, it's the sun's gravity that keeps our solar system together. This also makes me think of like the sign of the hexagram, where you've got the 6 other planets around the points of the hexagram, and then the sun in the center of it. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. And it's in the sense that that astrology would be attributed here. All right, so here it is on the Tree of Life. It connects Hod to Yesod. Yeah, there's some interesting things about that placement. Yeah, I'd have to kind of go through like a long explanation, but that's something you could sort of look into or meditate on. All right, so for our Yetziratic attribution, as I said, we've got the planet the sun, which we've already talked about, meanings of the sun, and I assume most of you have a basic sense of that. And we can think of the sun both in a more mythological sense, as well as in like an astrological sense. So there's obviously all the source of light and life is of course important, and then also more astrologically being about the ego, or the point of identification, or things of kind of like not necessarily the true will, but the sort of projects, what you're trying to do in the world and things like that. A lot of that comes out of the your sun placement in your chart, and I think that's all appropriate here. And then for magical weapons, Crowley gives the lamen, and so what he means by lamen here is like the lamen used in evocation rituals. So a lamen is something that the magician would hang like around her neck, to kind of hang like on her breast, and so that's like over the heart, and the heart is always associated with the sun, or the solar center is in the chest, and Crowley kind of talks about this as this lamen being what like represents the heart of the magician to the spirit that's being worked with. And so if you look at evocation traditions, you'll see like lamens that are worn. around the neck. And that's mainly what he's talking about here. Though we could think of some lamans in, like in the Golden Dawn tradition, possibly as well. But I think he's mainly talking about them in an evocation context. All right, and then also the bow and arrow are here. Now this is here because of Apollo, as we'll see, as a sun god. The bow and arrow is a traditional weapon of Apollo, as it is also of his sister Artemis or Diana. All right, so in the tarot, we've got Atu 19, the sun. And for perfume or incense, we've got olivinum, which more commonly, at least nowadays, known as frankincense. We've already talked about, frankincense as a solar perfume. And if you're familiar with the smell of frankincense, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a kind of glorious, pure, uplifting, invigorating scent. Very, very pleasant. I love the scent of frankincense. Cinnamon also is appropriate here, and I think some of that same qualities of being a little bit fiery, but also having some of that sort of solar glory kind of quality to it. I know that just makes intuitive sense to me. Yeah, so you can use cinnamon as a solar perfume. And then also all glorious odors. Interestingly, I hadn't actually realized this, but Crowley, it's maybe worth just taking a second to look at. In listing out the perfumes, all of the planetary perfumes are also given this kind of like all adjective odors. And so those adjectives actually are really nice kind of keywords for the planets. So we've already seen, this is the 6th one we've seen, so, but just sort of to review what we've already looked at. So for Mercury, we saw all fugitive odors. And then for the moon, we saw all sweet virginal odors, in addition to, like specific incenses. These were included there. For Venus, we saw all soft, voluptuous odors. For Jupiter, we saw all generous odors. For Mars, we saw all hot, pungent odors. Now, for the Sun, we're seeing all glorious odors. And then, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, next week we'll see Saturn and all evil odors. So it's a nice, kind of set of basic like qualities for the planets that come out right in, their perfumes. And that is one way that, sometimes the perfumes are attributed more mythologically or symbolically, but sometimes it's just because of this quality. So anything that has a glorious scent, the sun is associated with glory, and so you can just sort of qualitatively associate it. All right, for magical powers, we have the red tincture. So we're talking about alchemy here. And the red tincture is usually used as a synonym for the production of the philosopher's stone, the completion of the great work. The red tincture is a symbol of that. And we think about if you're familiar with the symbolism of like the black work, white work, and red work, this is like the red work, which is the completion of that. Obviously there's a ton of stuff to say about alchemy, but we'll just move on here. Also, the power of acquiring wealth. This one seemed a little bit funny to me. Acquiring wealth isn't usually like a solar thing. Though maybe, obviously the sun's metal is gold, so maybe that's where the association came in, but that one did seem a little bit funny to me. I would have thought that acquiring wealth would be more of like a Jupiter sort of power, but that's what's in 777. All right, color scales here. So for our king scale, we've got orange. Crowley talks about the orange here as being like the vividness of like animal life. So there's the idea of the sun as like something that's animating and life-giving. Now, obviously, this is actually very, I would say esoterically, we can talk about this in a number of different ways, but it is obviously quite literally true that, all of the food you've ever eaten, all that energy has ultimately come from sunlight, whether you're directly eating a plant, that's photosynthesized that, or you're eating an animal that had eaten a plant. Basically all of our food is transformed or, condensed solar energy. All right, for the queen scale, we have gold yellow. Now it's just coming out of the metal gold, like some of the other queen scale colors for the planets have come out of the metal. Then for our prince scale, we've just got a blending of orange and gold yellow for like a rich amber. And then our princess scale, we've got the amber again, but rayed red. Crowley talks about the red as being like a more pure color, whereas the amber is like a color that's like closer to materiality, showing that this somehow, even in like stepping down into manifestation, there's still somehow a retaining of like a pure quality here. All right, for animals, we've got the lion. We'll see a photo of a lion on the next path, so I didn't include it here. We also saw a lion, of course, with Teth, which corresponded with the sign Leo, which is the domicile of the sun. We also have the sparrowhawk here, and that's a sparrowhawk you'll see on the left. I'm not sure why sparrowhawk in particular. In the notes, Crowley just talks about it as if it's the hawk more generally. I'm not sure why the sparrowhawk in particular was given, but obviously that coming in through Egyptian mythology, as we'll see in a moment. Hawks are solar. They also have this quality of being all-seeing, or kind of mythologically as all-seeing. Now for stones, we have listed. I'm unclear on this one. It's listed as chrysolith, and now it's really easy to see the Greek etymology. Leth here is from lithos, meaning stone, and then chryso is like the Greek root meaning gold. So this literally would mean gold stone. But the actual stone that nowadays is referred to as chrysolith is peridot, which is a green stone rather than a golden one. Now, some gold in its raw state can be a little bit of a greenish color sometimes, maybe in its work state too, but I always think of it being more in the raw state. So it's possible, and there's a whole really interesting thing about how the Greeks perceived and named colors, which is quite different from ours. There's some ancient Greek stuff where they talk about the metal bronze being the same color as the ocean. So the Greeks may have actually thought about color in a different way than we do, where luster and things like that are more important. So it's possible that they would have seen the stone peridot as the same color as the metal gold, where we don't. But I thought peridot's a little bit confusing here, since this is it. Well, we saw peridot for Yod, right, for Virgo, where the yellow-green color is appropriate to Virgo, and so we saw peridot there. So it seemed weird to have peridot once for its gold color and once for its green color when it's actually the same color. But anyways, that's what we've got. All right, so for plants, we have the sunflower, and you can see the sunflower there on the right. It's extremely obvious. Heliotrope is a plant that will, like other plants as well, will turn towards the sun and will grow towards the sun, which is what heliotrope literally means, sun turning, or whatever in Greek. We also have the laurel, and then on the left there you can see the Roman poet Ovid wearing a laurel wreath. Laurel mythologically is associated with Apollo, who's a sun god, and then the Greeks started it, and then the Romans kind of really got into the idea of the laurel and the laurel wreath as an image of the Most High. It becomes really associated with the Roman emperors at some point. The wearing of the laurel wreath, and so it's a great honor and a symbol of very high station. And so great poets, athletes were sometimes honored, at the Pythian Games. Athletes won a laurel wreath, since I think Apollo was the kind of patron of the Pythian Games. So there's that, all that stuff going on there. And then Crowley also says that the nut is attributed to Resh because it's like the microcosm of life, since its fruit and its seed are this. A nut is both a fruit and a seed. It's not like a fruit that contains a seed. So somehow that's the microcosm of life. I couldn't quite figure that one out, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And then he also lists galangal as appropriate to the sun, since it's related to ginger. All right, and then look at some deities here. So for our Greek deities, we have Helios, who's the Titan of the sun. He's pretty much literally, he is the sun in a way that Apollo is not the sun. And so that's Helios there. You can see him on the right in his chariot, or in the picture on the left, he's on the right, driving his chariot there. And you can see he's got a kind of, what do you call it, aureole, or halo of the sun there. And his chariot is usually drawn by 4 horses, which are sometimes depicted as winged. And then we've got Apollo as well, who is a solar. He has a solar significance, although again he's not identified with the sun in the way that Helios, as the Titan of the sun, is. Let's just move on there. I think we've talked about Apollo already. So for Egyptian deities, we have Ra, and then also really any solar god. I mean, there's a ton of solar Egyptian deities, or deities that take on solar significances, and so any of them in that capacity could be attributed to Resh, but most particularly Ra as the sun god, and also, and obviously he is the head of the hawk or falcon. Okay, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so for we got our magical hierarchy of the sun here. All right, so this is a planetary hierarchy, so we'll follow the pattern we've seen in. Yeah, Joseph, this is. I was thinking that too. I actually was doing some solar magic yesterday, and I was using this hierarchy that we're looking at right now in order to do that. So it's very good timing. All right, so for our divine name, we've got here Yod He Vav He Eloah V'Da'ath, which means Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. Eloah is a name for God, and then V'Da'ath means like of knowledge. So it's like Tetragrammaton, God of knowledge. And then now it can be abbreviated in Hebrew as Yod Aleph Vav, and then we can kind of convert that into like Iao. So you can use either that full Hebrew phrase or you can vibrate Iao. And we talked about that before. I guess that would have been with the path of Teth and Leo. We talked about this topic. So let's just move on here. So our archangel of the sun is Raphael. Our planetary angel is Michael. Now again, Raphael and Michael, it's important not to get those confused with other angels and archangels with those same names. Those are two of the most common names that you'll see kind of repeated in different places. Just don't confuse like the planetary angel of the sun, Michael, with like the archangel of fire. Just keep those separate in your head. All right, and then our planetary intelligence is Nachiel, and our planetary spirit is Sorath. And then our heaven of Messiah, we've got two different possible names here. We have Shemesh or Chama. Shemesh is actually enters into Hebrew through like Babylonian. It's actually the name of the Babylonian, or one of the names of the Babylonian sun god is Shemesh. It's interesting. It ends up as like the name of the sun in Hebrew. All right, so then we've got our tarot trump here. This is Atu 19, the sun. Esoteric title is the Lord of the Fire of the World. Crowley says this is one of the simplest of the tarot cards, and I think that's just because the sun is quite simple. I mean, it has all these significations of of unity, of totality, of being like the origin of things, and so it makes sense that it would be a simple rather than a complex thing. Let's see, a few symbols worth pointing out here. So in the very center of the sun there, you can see that we have the rose. This is the same rose from like the rose cross, but now the cross has become the sun. So that sort of symbolic transformation makes a lot of sense. I don't want to get into all the details of how that happens now, but hopefully that makes sense to some of you, how the cross could become the sun. And we still got the rose, in the center of it there. The sun is radiating these sort of 12 rays. And then we see the signs of the zodiac arranged between those rays. So obviously those 12 rays refer to the signs of the zodiac, but Crowley says that they also refer to the Hebrew name Hu, which is spelled He Vav Aleph. It literally means he, like the masculine third person pronoun, but it's used to refer to God, and it's specifically a title for Kether. So this is being identified with the highest deity here. In the sun, although we usually associate the sun more with like Tifereth, the sun, at least in certain contexts, can take on a very, very high meaning. So we see the sun, like in the center of the zodiac signs, or even is almost like emanating the zodiac signs in a sense. And of course, the sun's motion through the zodiac signs is what defines the seasons. So yesterday the sun entered Cancer, at the moment of solstice. And actually, when we saw the amber color in our color scale here, let me jump back to that actually. Yeah, so when we saw the amber here, that amber is the, Crowley talks about how that's also the amber of Cancer, and we saw the color amber attributed, to Cancer and to the letter Heth. And so as representing, the sign, or as the sign, that the sun enters at the solstice, like it did yesterday, it's appropriate that amber is also a solar color in addition to being a Cancerian color. So okay, yeah. So we see the two children here, which are interesting transformation of the children, like that you can see in more traditional depictions of the cards. Where now they have these butterfly wings, indicating that they've been sort of transformed and freed. They've gone through a transformative process. And the idea specifically of the transformative process here is like the acceptance of the law of the aeon, the acceptance of the aeon of Horus. So we could think of this as like, the world, and especially with the green hill that we see here, like the green is that fertility of the earth coming through the sun. So this is the idea of like regeneration and renewal, and the kind of the renewal of the entire planet by the, at least symbolically by, the coming forth of the Aeon of Horus and the Book of the Law of Thelema. The idea of that is something that is, rejuvenating and giving a kind of rebirth. Yeah. Let's see, we see a wall around the hill there at the top. I always thought it would be possible, with the rose and cross can sometimes take on the significance of like the male and female genitals united. So I always kind of thought the wall, the circular like hill there, or the hill, which is almost a mountain there. It's quite pointed with like the circular wall there could potentially be related to like the rose and cross with that genital symbolism. But Crowley also talks about the wall as showing that although the children have been like liberated and freed by the new aeon doesn't imply like a lack of structure. So although there's a freedom and an autonomy, it's not a kind of like formless, chaotic freedom. That there's still, the need for structure. They're not like an externally imposed structure in the new aeon. There's not a huge amount to say. This card, like Crowley says, it's actually like a very simple sort of card, but it's a really great card to meditate on. I've always really enjoyed, doing meditations on the card, and just sort of staring right into the center of the sun there and meditating on that image. Especially in a more qualitative sense, the way it expresses, the vibrancy and dynamism of the solar energy, and especially that solar energy as being connected to, the aeon of Horus. And of course, we talk about Horus, but it's really like Ra-Hor, right? Which is a, putting together of Ra and Horus, a combination of those two gods, who's is as much solar as he is martial. Let's see. I guess it's a little hard to see. It's just above the children's heads there. Let's see if you can. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but yeah, there it is, right there. It's easier to see if you look. That's not obviously a wall, but if you look at like older depictions of the tarot card, you can see the wall more obviously. But I guess you're right. I guess that doesn't look, that much like a wall. So no, you're definitely not stupid. Oh, a snake. That might be better. I kind of like snake there. There's the whole Egyptian connection between like snakes and the sun and everything. That actually you're mistaken, or we're mistaken, but that actually works very nicely. All right. Let's just move on here. All right. So last letter for today is Shin, which is going to be a more complicated letter than any of the ones we've seen so far. All right, so Shin is one of our mother letters. It's also our third and final mother letter. So far, we saw Aleph attributed to air, Mem attributed to water, and now we've got Shin. And its attribution is going to be complicated. All right, so it's hieroglyph. The hieroglyphic origin of this letter was unclear. It's possibly from a hieroglyph meaning bow, or one meaning sun, or one meaning breast, or possibly like not through Egyptian, but through another like pictogram that might have meant tooth. That one's unclear. But this is definitely the Phoenician origin here. Is this looks kind of like a W, but it means tooth. I think the idea of this as a tooth is like a molar rather than one of your front teeth. That's my understanding of that, anyways. Its sound is it's always a sibilant sound, and so this can be like an S or an SH, which are very similar sounds. But our English equivalent is always really going to be the SH, because we don't want to confuse it with Samek, which is going to be given as just the S. So the Shin can't have the same sound as Samek, just as the S sound, but we don't want to get that mixed up when we're transliterating. It's got a value of 300. Spelled in full, it is Shin, Yod, and Nun. Its value spelled in full is 360, which is interesting. It's the number of degrees in a circle. 36 times 10, 12 times 30. There's a lot of like looking at the factors of the number and things like that. You can get a lot of interesting stuff out of. And it would also be 1010 if we use final values. Noon final is 700, so it'd be 700 plus 300 plus 10, which I don't believe has any particular correspondences. Though as 1010, you could kind of work out some stuff for the digits or whatever. All right, so for meaning, it's tooth. Now again, this is just through the Phoenician letter. Shin isn't like the Hebrew word for tooth. In fact, there doesn't seem to be, at least not that I could find, like there's nothing in Strong's of a Hebrew word spelled like Shin, Yod, Nun, at least not in ancient Hebrew. But the letter Shin is used, and this is something that's I think good to be aware of. It's used as an abbreviation very commonly in like Hebrew, in Jewish like religious usages for different words that start with Shin. The most common one is probably Shaddai, which is an ancient name for God that we've seen before in some of our hierarchies. It's spelled Shin, Daleth, Yod. So name for God. Also Shalom. Of course, it's used as like a greeting, but it literally means peace. And then also the Shekinah, which also begins with the letter Shin, and is in the Kabbalah the feminine in Jewish Kabbalah, like the feminine presence of God here on earth. The Shekinah is actually kind of an alternate name for Malkuth. So this is the idea of like the presence of God here in reality, like here in manifest reality with us, but specifically conceived of as feminine. So it's a whole really, really deep and interesting topic all in its own right. But yeah, it's good to be aware that the letter Shin stands for all of those things. And there's actually a hand gesture that's used by the Jewish priests in some rituals where they do this with their hands, right, to make like the letter Shin. And you can see how that resembles like the letter Shin, right? And so that's used as a sign of, used as part of like an invocation of, either of like the powers of Shaddai or as is sometimes understood as like bringing in the powers of the Shekinah. And this is actually, what's his name? Leonard Nimoy, who played, what's his name, Spock on, I'm not a Star Trek person at all, who played Spock on Star Trek. He had gone and seen Jewish services when he was a boy and had seen the priests use this sign. And then at some point in one of the episodes, they wanted Spock to have a particular gesture, and he came up with that. So the live long and prosper thing from Star Trek is actually the shape of the Hebrew letter Shin. Sort of fun trivia if you're into Star Trek. So it actually is a sign of a blessing. So I saw a little thing with Leonard Nimoy. He was talking about how it's funny, people like, Star Trek fans, go around giving each other that sign, and it's actually like a Hebrew blessing gesture, which is pretty cool. All right, so this is our 31st path, second to last path, right? All right, so Westcott gives the 31st path is the perpetual intelligence. But why is it so called? Because it regulates the motions of the sun and moon in their proper order, each in an orbit convenient for it. And then Kaplan gives 31, continuous consciousness. Why is it called this? Because it directs the paths of the sun and moon according to their laws of nature, each one in its proper orbit. So this is a really interesting one. There's some things that I can't really say here about it, but this idea of like of a fire or a fiery power that regulates the motions of the sun and moon, I think that's something that you could reflect on. So I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader, as they always say in like math textbooks. But yeah, let's move on. So here it is on the Tree of Life. It connects Hod to Malkuth. And so as I was saying, the paths of Shin and Qoph, they take on these the kind of equivalencies or symbolic kind of equivalencies with like the Ida and Pingala of yogic anatomy, of the fiery or the solar and lunar channels. Let's just move on here. All right, so our Yetziratic attribution. So now I'm going to split this now. All right, yeah, we've got to the point where we can talk about this. So as we talked about earlier, I think at the beginning of the class, the last two paths, the 31st and 32nd path, are divided into double attributions. The reason this happens is because unlike you have 7 double letters for 7 planets, 12 single letters for the 12 zodiac signs, but then you've got 3 mother letters, but then the elements can be seen as either 3 or 4 or 5, right? So with 3 elements, we've got fire, water, and air. And so that's the signification we're seeing here. The main significance for Shin is as fire. And so that would make like a trinity of elements with the 3 mother letters of fire, water, and air. But then we've also got like the 4th element of earth, which we'll see next week. And then we've also got the 5th element of spirit, which we'll see in just a moment. All right, so this is like the main attribution for Shin is fire. And that's like if you're reading 777, just the column that's numbered is 31. That will be the attribution to fire. All right, so yeah, so we'll talk about just that, or not column, but row, I guess. Yeah, the just 31 as the row is fire. So we're going to talk about just that row, and then we'll talk about the secondary row, the 31 beasts, like the split in a minute. All right, so this is fire. And so our magical weapon for fire is the wand, lamp, or pyramid of fire. Now the wand here, this is specifically like the fire wand. Crowley makes this point about not confusing this wand with like the wand of Hokmah. This is specifically the elemental weapon. So paired with the air dagger, the water cup, and then the pentacle for earth. Also the lamp, which is pretty obvious. I mean, a lamp is literally a thing that's on fire, right? So it represents fire nicely. And then the pyramid of fire is an object used in some of the Golden Dawn rituals. So you can look into that if you want to, but I don't really want to say anything about that here. All right, so in the tarot, we've got Achu20, the Aeon. Now, Crowley, in the Thoth deck, it's going to be called the Aeon. In older decks, it's called the Judgment or the Last Judgment. Yeah, and so we'll come back to that change when we get to the tarot card. Now, also, all wands can be attributed to fire, right? The whole suit of wands is the suit of fire. And then also all knights in the Thoth deck, right? Like in other decks, that would be the king, right? But Crowley uses the knight. Yeah, so like the Knight of Cups is going to be the fiery part of water. The Knight of Swords would be the fiery part of air, and so on. All right, so for perfume or incense, we have molybdenum, which, as we've said, is frankincense. And again, so frankincense has this sort of double quality of being solar and being fiery, which we saw made it doubly appropriate, like on the path of Teth for Leo, which is a fire sign in the domicile of the sun. But so here we have it as just a specifically fiery incense. And in I think we've talked about this a little, the incense of Moses, that 4-part incense, molybdenum or frankincense represents, at least in the later kind of interpretation of that incense, represents the fiery part, since the four components are attributed to the 4 elements. We've talked about that, I think, a little bit before. And also all fiery odors, anything else that you could think of as fiery would be appropriate here as well. Now for magical powers, Crowley gives evocation, which I'm not really clear on why evocation would be attributed to fire. Oh, you know what? I just realized what it probably is. It's probably because of something called the Z documents. I wonder if Shin was evocation. I'd have to look that up. But anyways, if you don't know what the Z documents are, don't worry about that. But then he also gives pyromancy, which makes a lot of sense. And pyromancy is, divination by fire, which is a really easy form. You can use pretty informally. You could use this, in company with ritual or something like that. Invoking some sort of a fire spirit or something like that, and then gazing into flames or into hot coals. But you can also just do it kind of informally. As a nice divination sort of practice. If you're around a fire or campfire or something like that, you could try practicing a little pyromancy and see if you could, derive some sort of an oracle or something like that by gazing either into the flame or into the hot coals after the fire's died down. So that's pyromancy. All right, and let's look at our color scales. So again, we're just dealing with the main attribution for Shin here, and so this is like the color scales of fire. So for the king scale, we have a glowing orange scarlet. For the queen scale, we have a vermilion. Vermilion is an interesting color. The vermilion color was derived from what's the word I'm looking for? It was derived from cinnabar. which is like a mercury compound, and mercury can be extracted from it. So that's that's an interesting thing. This sort of fiery mercurial kind of thing going on here. All right, and then for our print scale, now this is This is a little bit of a deviation from some of the normal logic of the print scale, where the main color scarlet there is obviously scarlet and vermilion together, or sort of an orange scarlet with vermilion would give you a kind of scarlet color. But unlike most of the other print scale colors, it's been flecked gold here. And then in the princess scale, we've got vermilion again, but now it's flecked both crimson and emerald. So Crowley talks about the princess scale color here being that the vermilion of fire has continued, but is no longer that the crimson, among other things, can be attributed to Binah. And then emerald, is like a color of Venus. So this kind of feminine and more, less fiery quality that's coming in here now shows that the fire here has become less like not a destructive element, but has embraced some of its almost like opposite meanings and become more balanced and stable here. All right, and then for stones, we've got a fire opal. I was a little bit suspicious that this is actually like a real opal and not like a slightly edited image, but fire opals do look something like that. I mean, they have that sort of multicolored quality of all opals, but they're particularly like an orange-red sort of color. All right, and then for our animals, we've got the lion. Now, specifically, this is the lion as the cherub of fire. The lion is also a solar animal, so we saw it as a possible attribution for Resh a minute ago, and we also saw it attributed to Leo, of course. But this is specifically the lion as the cherub of fire. All right, and then for our plants, we have the hibiscus, red hibiscus on the left, or the red poppy, which Crowley says are chosen entirely for their colors. And again, so it would only be the red poppy or the red hibiscus that would be attributed here, not like other colors of those same flowers. And then the nettle here, I think, is just being attributed because if you touch a nettle, it burns. And so that's kind of a fiery quality, is the pain it causes. All right, so now we've got our magical hierarchy for fire. So again, following the same pattern as other elemental hierarchies that we've seen before. So our divine name is Elohim. And of course, this is the divine name you would use if you're doing like a greater invoking ritual of the pentagram of fire. Elohim would be the name that you're using, to charge each one of your invoking fire or banishing fire pentagrams. All right, and then for Bria, we have the Archangel of the Quarter. So this is, like when you're doing Liber Resh, this is the Archangel that's in the south, right? South is attributed to fire. And so this is Michael, the Archangel of Fire, and the Archangel of the South. Then we've got three entities here for the Yetziratic. We've got the Angel of the Element, which is Aral. Then the ruler of the element, which is Seraph, and then the king of the elemental spirits, which doesn't come in through Hebrew, so there's no Hebrew spelling of it, but is named Jinn. And this is probably, I assume, a name taken from, like the Arabic Jinn, for spirits who are, I don't know a ton about like Arabic, mythology, but I think they're usually kind of fiery or air. They're seen as like spirits of fire and air. So I assume that's how that name is being derived. And then in Asaya, we have the heaven of Asaya, which is just the Hebrew name for, or word for fire, which is Esh. All right, so everything we just saw, that was the main line of in 777 of line 31 for fire. And so now we're going to see the 31 bis. I'm saying bis as the pronunciation there. It's obviously, it's not clear whether he's using, this is like French or an abbreviation or the Latin word by itself, but it's definitely from the Latin root meanings like split or divided or two or whatever, right? Like bisected and so on. So this is like the split attribution for Shin now. And so now this secondary attribution, which you'll see in 777 as like 31 bis down at the bottom, this is the Yetzirah attribution here is just to spirit. So the rest of the correspondences we'll see here are for spirit. So our magical weapon is the winged egg. Now, this is probably not something that you would actually be like employing or using. I mean, I suppose you could sculpt like a winged egg or something like that, but I've never heard of anyone doing that. So this is more of like a symbolic attribution. And Qoph talks about the winged egg as representing like a phallic power. And actually, what does he say? Let me look this up real fast. He explained it in, I thought, a nice way. Where am I? Let's see. So he says the winged egg is symbolical of the spiritualized phallic energy. He says the egg is akasha, the source of all creation. And he says there are many equivalent symbols. So that's right. That's what I was thinking about, was the akasha here. So akasha is basically an element from the Indian system. Often depicted as an egg or a black egg. And we'll see that significance again in just a moment. So egg as like a symbol of spirit, or as, and Crowley gives this kind of phallic sort of signification of the egg. And by phallic here, I think we can think of it more as like the generative power. Sometimes Crowley's using phallic to mean like specifically referring to like the male organ, but sometimes I think we can understand phallic as meaning something more like generative or sexual or life power, which is just as resident on all humans as in men, despite some of the chauvinism that we see in Crowley sometimes. So representing in the wing, of course, give it this sort of power of motion and being able to to move and to fly. So a lot of stuff to think about there. And we see the winged egg as a symbol a bunch of times in the tarot trumps. So interesting thing to think about that as like a symbol of spirit, or as the symbol of the spiritualized generative power, and look at how that manifests in different tarot cards. All right, so in the tarot, now this will correspond to the same tarot trump. The letter Shin in both of its versions correspond, both its main form and the secondary form. They both correspond, to Achu 20, the Aeon. But now, because we're in spirit here, there's no attribution to like the wands, because we're not talking about fire anymore. Although, I didn't write it, but sometimes anyways, I'm not sure how important this idea is to Crowley, but sometimes like all of the 22 major arcana, the 22 trumps, sometimes those are given all attributed to spirit. So I guess we could say like all trumps or all 22 major arcana could also be attributed here. I'll try to remember to add that in. Okay, and then for perfume or incense, we don't have one. There's not one here. And I think the idea here, with the lack of an incense, is that spirit is something that exists before the qualities. So there's no like scent that could represent spirit. Now that same logic, that should also mean that there's no colors, there's no anything attributed to it, which isn't the case. But the idea here is that that spirit has no quality, or is before quality. We can think of it as more like metaphysically prior, not necessarily before in like the sense of like existing before in time, but as like one step closer to the undifferentiated source of things before quality comes to exist. All right, and then for magical powers, we've got invisibility. So it makes sense for spirit, as something not visible, as something that's kind of within matter or within the world, but can't be seen. Right now, this is spirit here as an element, rather than as like a part of the soul or something like that, or connected to those sort of ideas. Right. So this is like spirit as the element, as the fifth element, the quintessence, which is both unites the four elements, which is their source, and also is sort of concealed within them. So this is idea of like being like in the world, but in a concealed fashion. Which also, we talked about how Shin is like an abbreviation for the Shekinah. The idea of the presence of God within the world sort of works nicely here, I think. But anyways, right, so you have invisibility, that idea of concealment. Crowley talked about actually experimenting with magical invisibility. I think when he was in Mexico, he was doing that, and talks about how he could walk down the street and like people would almost like bump into him and no one would notice him. Interesting thing. Interesting. William Burroughs, the writer, he often did like magical practices connected with invisibility as well, and bragged about how he could walk down like streets full of vendors, like in when he was living in North Africa, and no one would try to sell him anything after he had done his invisibility stuff. And then we also have transformation. That's an interesting one. That's something you could contemplate maybe. And then also the vision of the genius. And I think by genius here, it doesn't mean like you're going to have a vision of Albert Einstein or something. This is the genius as like the higher genius, the individual genius, which I think we can basically take as another word for the holy guardian angel, the higher self. Or like, the daimon, if you're familiar with the Greek traditions of that sort of guardian spirit ideas. I think that's what we're talking about here. And that makes sense for spirit. Oh, you know what? You guys have probably actually been seeing, I didn't actually go into presentation mode, did I? There, that probably looks better. Oh, well. Okay. So here we got our color scales. All right, what is going on here? All right, so for our king scale color, we've got white merging into gray. Now that probably looks like a white against I've used a slightly gray background as I thought it was easier to see colors against it. So this probably looks white, but it actually is a little bit gray, of like a pure white. Now, white is totally appropriate for spirit, as like white light, the color that, the thing that gets like differentiated into the different colors. And so again, this idea of something that's like before quality. Now, why it's white merging into gray, I wasn't quite clear on. But yeah, maybe something to reflect on. And then for the queen scale color, we have deep purple, nearly black, which is interesting, right? It's almost the opposite of the king scale color. And I think we can think of this as like the akasha, the idea of like the black egg from the Indian system representing spirit. And so it's interesting to think of spirit being something we could think of as either white, as like pure, undifferentiated light, or as black, as something concealed and unknown or invisible, or again, as also a different way of looking at all the colors, right? We can look at colors either additively or subtractively. So both white and black can have that symbol of all of the color, the significance of all of the colors. All right, and then for our prince and princess scales, things get a little complicated. So it gives the 7 prismatic colors, but it gives the violet being outside. And so, well, because I've seen the princess scale like represented this way before, I was thinking that this probably means like the image or whatever is of like concentric circles. So I threw together some concentric colored circles there. So you can see the prince scale on the left. That's the 7 prismatic colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Literally the 7 like colors of dividing white light. And then for the princess scale, we've got white, red, yellow, blue, and black. And so this is the 4 elements. So black on the outside, being like the furthest from the center, represents earth. Then we have the blue, which is water. Then yellow is air. Red is fire. And the white in the center is spirit. So you notice the ordering here is fire, air, water, earth. I'm not sure if that's something we've talked about in this class, and we talked about it in the elements and pentagrams class that I did back in, what was it, like February? Where sometimes, probably more commonly, we talk about the elements being ordered as fire, water, air, earth. But in like following, I think, Aristotle, that sort of Aristotelian scheme, they're ordered as fire, air, water, earth. And that's following, again, this Aristotle's idea about the elements in their natural places. So fire and air rise, but because fire is hotter and more dynamic, it rises higher. And then water and earth fall, but because earth is heavier, again, in Aristotle's understanding, because earth is heavier, it goes to the bottom, and then water sits on top of it. So this is like that sort of ordering. So we've got spirit as the highest here, which we can give as like the 8th or whatever, beyond even the fire, and then in like kind of descending order down to the earth. Crowley also talks about these 5 colors here, very specifically representing these 5 colors being like the pentagram and the perfection of the pentagram. So we can think about it that way too. These are like all 5. We talked about this thing a lot in the last class series on the pentagram and the elements, the symbolism of the pentagram as like the 4 elements harmonized and brought under the dominion of spirit. And so we can see that, I think here, and especially this is a Saya, right? This is the princess scale. So this is like spirit in its most material form. And so we can think of it as like spirit as ordering or giving rise to or like having dominion over the 4 elements, which here represent like all parts of manifest creation, right? And especially like in a traditional cosmological sense, like everything in the sublunar world is made of the 4 elements, and then spirit has dominion over that or presides over that. Okay, so then now we don't have a ton of, if you like look in 777, you'll see that for this secondary attribution of Shin, there's not a ton of correspondences, but there are a few. So I'll give you, so animals here. Now remember, I've just been writing animals. The actual like column in 777 is like animals, real and imaginary. So this is one of our imaginary animals. This is the Sphinx, but specifically the Sphinx when sorted and crowned. And so the only image that I'm aware of as a crowned and like sorted Sphinx is from the tarot cards, like the Fortune or the Wheel of Fortune. So that's little bit of the card from the Thoth deck, and then you can also see that the Sphinx with the sword in some older decks as well. And we talked about when we talked about the wheel, we talked about how the Sphinx. Well, anyway, I'm just going to leave that stuff about the gunas aside now because I actually get a little bit confused about the way the 3 animals work with the gunas. But anyways, that's the idea here. All right, and then for stones, we don't have one. It doesn't list one. So again, we can talk about I think rather than with the incense being about this being before quality, I think we could think that it doesn't really make like a stone as the sort of densest and most material, part of like manifest world. It doesn't really make sense for a stone to correspond with spirit. I guess is the lesson that we could draw from that. So for plants, Crowley gives the almond and flower. I'm not really sure why it's specifically given as like in flower rather than other times, but that's also the attribution given to Kether. It may sort of make sense that spirit and Kether would have the same attributions as they have that same sort of quality as being the source and originary thing, the thing that lies beyond. It's still at the place where like the opposites, the contraries haven't differentiated each other. Or differentiated themselves. I guess they differentiate each other too. Now the symbolic meaning here for almond is biblical, and so the almond refers to Aaron's rod. Now Aaron and Moses both have rods made of almond, and they produce a number of miracles through that. Aaron's rod, some of the Egyptian like priests turn rods into snakes, and then Aaron's rod turns into a snake and devours the other ones. Showing the superiority of like the Jewish priesthood over the Egyptians and all that stuff. And there's a bunch of other miracles in the Bible that either Aaron or Moses' rod produces. But in the ceremonial magic tradition, Aaron's rod gets very associated with like the wand. And so almond wood is often given like in some grimoires and things like that. You'll be instructed to make a wand out of almond. And so that's how that's coming in, through this biblical, mythological association with Aaron and the miraculous powers of like Aaron's rod. And there's also some stuff you can do with, I forget if it's with the name Aaron or with the Hebrew name Rod, but there's some gematria and symbolic stuff that you can do with that name that shows the rod as equal to the entire middle pillar, like from Kether all the way down to Malkuth. So there's some interesting symbolism there of like this center and vertical upright thing, which is very appropriate for the wand. And so, yeah, I've got 2 pictures of almond there. That's like the flower there, and then just like the almond tree on the right. All right, so now we've got our magical hierarchy for spirit. So this hierarchy is really weird. It's not really even a complete hierarchy, and there's nothing else like this in any of the other hierarchies. You're not really, because this hierarchy isn't complete, or not because of it, but you're not really going to be doing like ritual like just to invoke spirit. Spirit is usually like in with the greater ritual of the pentagram, spirit is usually being invoked sort of with the elements, either as like a synthesis of all four of them, or as like spirit active or passive as a kind of foundation for invoking the specific elements. But you won't really be doing like invocations of just the element of spirit by itself. So it's not really an issue that, I mean, you could, I suppose, but yeah, some of the hierarchy stuff gets more complicated. Anyways, for we've got 3 different divine names here, all associated with Atziluth. So the first one is just a kind of general divine name that we can associate with spirit, and that's Yeshua, which is a sort of direct, in the Christian this was a name made up by the Christian Kabbalists, and we went into some detail about this back in the Pentagram class series. So symbolically here, though, the main thing to understand is that this is taking the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, and then inserting the letter Shin, the letter of spirit, into the center of it. And so, like in our Thelemic tradition, the relationship to Jesus is maybe not completely irrelevant, but mostly irrelevant. And the point here is just that this name representing like the powers of the pentagram and the 4 elements with spirit in their center, or spirit like crowning them and having dominion over them. Okay, then we've also got divine names for spirit active and for spirit passive. And these are divine names. This is like these 2 names that you would use in like doing in like a greater ritual of the pentagram for spirit active or passive. So the first one here for spirit passive, I've just given you the abbreviation here. We talked about this again in the pentagram class, and I think it's come up at least once in the course of this series, maybe. Or maybe not actually, but anyways, this is a phrase, Ata Gibor Le'olam Adonai, which means you are mighty forever, O Lord. Yeah, so you'll see that abbreviated as Agla, and there's some tradition, like some kind of tradition coming out of the Golden Dawn, where people talk about just actually vibrating the name, like just Agla as a divine name in itself. Though our tradition, or the tradition that's come down to us specifically, says that this was always taught to vibrate the full phrase. But I've just given you the abbreviation here. All right, and for spirit passive, we have the name Eheye, which is most especially associated with Kether. And so again, we have this, we've seen this a few times already, but some of the correspondences for Kether kind of bleed into the correspondences for spirit, which is entirely appropriate. And we see that again for the archangel. This is the archangel Metatron, who is the archangel of Kether, and is here by that, for that reason. Let's see, what was I going to say about Metatron? Oh, right. Sometimes the name Metatron is sometimes interpreted as actually coming into Hebrew through Greek, which is entirely possible. And if that's true, some others have questioned it, like Gershom Scholem denies that this is the case, that it came in through Greek. But if it does come through Greek, the etymology would be like meta, meaning either above or after, and then tron would be like from the Greek word for throne. So like kind of above the throne, or like behind the throne, meaning like the throne of God. But again, that may or may not be a kind of spurious etymology. But Metatron, either way, Metatron is the archangel of spirit and the archangel of Kether. Now, there are no Yetziratic names attributed to spirit, which is what I meant about the hierarchy not being complete. And then for our heaven of Messiah, we have this word, eth, which I don't think is an actual Hebrew word. I think it's a kind of like created word specifically for like symbolic reasons. And it's composed of the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So it has that same idea of like, alpha and omega as the first and last Greek letters. People, talk about things being like the alpha and omega. And that's, a very like Christian symbolism, for God, and the idea of totality, the beginning and the end, and everything in between, obviously. So F has this idea of like the essence. And if you're familiar with the alchemical word azoth, this is a similar thing, where azoth draws from the first and last letters of several different languages. This is just the first and last letters of Hebrew, but we can use it as a name for spirit, even though it's not like the Hebrew word for spirit. Oh, okay, let's see. We've got a comment here from Joseph. See, Joseph says, Lama Duquette talks about the almond rod in the middle pillar in chapter 5 of Chicken Kabbalah. Aaron's rod was a staff of almond wood that at a very auspicious moment miraculously bloomed. Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about the blooming of the rod. Thank you for that, Joseph. The Hebrew word for a rod of almond enumerates to the prime number 463. Oh, that's right. Okay, so it's 463 as Tav, Samek, and Gimel. Those are the three paths that make up the tree of life, right? The most balanced and direct path from material existence to supreme Godhead, of which the human spine is the microcosmic reflection. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Joseph. And I forgot about the thing about the miraculous blooming of the rod, and I assume that's actually the reason why almond was given specifically as flowering, is for that reason. So yeah, thanks for that. That's great. And yeah, and thanks for reminding me about how you get to the middle pillar from there. Okay, great. Yeah, so our Torah time, we're already like 2 minutes over, so we'll just talk about this for just a couple minutes. Yeah, so this is the Aeon, Atu 20, esoteric title, the spirit of the primal fire. Now, this is, of course, as we've said, this is being attributed to Shin, whether it's fire or spirit, or maybe even both at the same time. So now this is completely different. This card is totally changed from the Atu 20, like in the older decks, from the Golden Dawn, the Marseille, whatever. That's Judgment or the Last Judgment, and has completely and totally different symbolism. So Crowley's completely changed this one. And so Crowley's idea here is that the 20th Atu would represent something like the essence or one of the main like transformative processes or ideas within the particular Aeon. So the idea that, that the Last Judgment would have shown that quality for like for the previous Aeon, the idea of the Aeon of Osiris. Now in the Aeon of Horus, you can't really like update that or just create a new version of it. You have to basically create an entirely new card. Yeah. So there's some interesting relationships between like the idea of like the Christian or Judeo-Christian apocalypse and the actual like events of 1904 and the reception of the Book of the Law that some of you might be familiar with. And of course, there's a lot of stuff about Babylon and the Beast and all that sort of stuff that fits in with this idea of like the revelation of the Aeon of Horus, and Thelema as like the event itself as being like the destruction of the previous world. So the Last Judgment as like the thing that happens at the end of the world. There's that symbolism too. But now the ending of the world is now an event that happened in the past, right? Crowley has that great line about he says, like, in April of 1904, the world was destroyed by fire. And so obviously he doesn't mean that in some sort of literal sense, but that the idea that the world as, not the physical world, but like the world that we live in or the world that we inhabit, that thing ended and a new world was born. Even if most people haven't realized that, that's part of the symbolic, in kind of esoteric understanding of the Aeon of Horus. So this card is really a kind of, we could almost think of it as like a version of like the narrative changed. Exactly, Kristen. So not like the world, like the actual physical world, but the world that exists in our heads, our understanding of, of human life and culture and civilization and all those types of ideas. Exactly. It's like a paradigm shift is a similar sort of idea. So yeah, this is, we could almost think of this card as like a version of the Stele of Revealing, essentially. And so we've got, Nuit in the background. And you can see that she's, really got, like in her breast there, you can see our these sort of spiral galaxies there. So there she is as the cosmic goddess. And then inside of her is that like egg shape. And again, we can think of the egg of like Akasha and the egg of spirit again, or the winged egg, that spiritualized or generative energy. And then inside of that egg, we see Ra-Hoor-Khuit, who's the lord of the Aeon. He's solar and martial god. Again, as the synthesis of like Nuit and Hadit. Oh, and then we see Hadit below. Hadit might be a little hard to see. That's the sun, the solar disk of Hadit there, and then the two wings there and there. So that's Hadit and Nuit, who produce, through their union, give birth to Ra-Hoor-Khuit. Nuit and Hadit, of course, are unmanifest. They're both like 0. And then Ra-Hoor-Khuit would be like the one or the entire tree of life, whereas Nuit and Hadit are something even beyond that. But then, now the idea of Ra-Hoor or of Heru-Raha, the Lord of the Aeon, is actually a double form. So Ra-Hoor-Khuit is like the visible form, but then he also has a twin who is Hor-Par-Krat. And that's the figure that you see kind of invisible there, who's like feet down at the bottom and head up there, giving the sign of silence. That's Hor-Par-Krat or Harpocrates, who's the Egyptians understood to just be the child form of Horus. And that gesture that he's making there, right, like that. For the Egyptians, this was just like a sign of being a child. It's like kind of the equivalent of like sucking your thumb. They had sucking the forefinger. But the Greeks interpreted this as like the gesture of silence. And so in that sort of Greco-Egyptian tradition, coming into our tradition, Hor-Par-Krat is the god of silence, and still the child form of Horus, but also kind of is the twin of Ra-Hoor-Khuit, where Ra-Hoor-Khuit is the more active and expressive form, and then Harpocrates or Hor-Par-Krat is like the passive, receptive form of this twin god. You're familiar with like the sign of the Enterer and the sign of silence, from like the Golden Dawn or the AA. Ra-Hoor-Khuit is like the sign of the Enterer, the active, expressive power, and then Harpocrates is obviously the sign of silence. We see a letter Shin there at the bottom. And then also in the Shin, we also see these the 3 kind of human figures there who are in like kind of prayer or aspiration to the Aeon. All right, yeah, so we're a little over time, but I think that's all right. So yeah, that'll conclude our class for today. And we've only got 1 letter left, only 1 left. So we'll do that next time. We'll look at Tav, which again will have this double attribution, and there'll actually be even more to talk about for Tav than with Shin, but luckily we'll have an entire hour and a half. So we'll spend 40 minutes or so talking about Tav, and then we'll do some summary and wrap up. And as I was saying, I've got a couple of bonus images, some cool stuff from Frida Harris that isn't often seen, and some other things as well. So that should be a lot of fun, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys all next week. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes there. For anyone who is sort of coming in new here, for more about our work, you can visit tofts.org/FAQ. There's my email address if you want to contact me or be added to the public Google group. And we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of the academic or initiatory tracks. So yeah, thanks everybody. Almost done here. So looking forward to concluding this next week. See, I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm just going to stop the recording.